Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of What's Going On, and I'm your host Tom DeAmber. As always, we are very thankful for your time today. We have a little bit of a different format than what you may be used to if you've been watching previous shows. We have a guest today. His name is William Flick. Bill is not only a friend, but he is a diligent student of not only the history of the organizations that are controlling our money system and international affairs, but he's also very much up on our money system for what it is and what it is not. If you've watched previous shows, you know that we have done quite an extensive study on our money system from what it was supposed to be in the founding era into what we have today. And so with that being said, I want to say hello, Bill. Good. Thank you for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me, Tom.
All right. I wanted to have you on, Bill, because not only knowing you for years, but I'm very much aware how much of a diligent student you are in the research that you do, and I thought it would be a good perspective for our people. And I wanted to start off, Bill, with talking about the Federal Reserve. And I was wondering if you could give us your impressions on particularly what the Federal Reserve is and what it is not.
Well, the Federal Reserve isn't a bank as you'd know a bank to be, the way we're taught that a bank is. It's a giant credit organization, and it's owned by some national banks inside the United States, also foreign banks. And their prime purpose is to create money out of thin air and charge interest on it, and to create a boom and then create a bust. So property and real wealth can be accumulated by them and their heirs. And it's pretty much that's the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you say the real wealth, Bill, let's get into a little bit of the money system itself, okay? We have the idea of tangible items such as the clothes we're wearing and the food we eat and so forth. And then when it comes into the money system, we have intrinsic value and we have fiat currency. Would you mind giving your impressions of the difference between the two?
Well, obviously, somewhere down the line, they did a trick, and we believe it to be 1913. It went from receipts of wealth, and I like to explain it sort of like the way the farmers used to do it in the Midwest. They had commodity banks, and the commodity banks were based on wealth, things that people wanted and needed. And at that time it was, we'll say, soybeans. And you would drive your truck full of soybeans up, and they would give you a receipt, and you could use that receipt as money. And in the banking centers and along the coasts, more than in the inner, the barter system was based on gold and silver. And after 1913, they confused the systems together, and in 1933 took us out from under any commodities, and we went straight to a fiat, out of thin air currency, extinguishable upon repayment, and it required more paid back than it was put out into circulation.
And the whole thing about this, Bill, and it's my understanding, is that not only did they take all the intrinsic value, the wealth out of our money system, but then, and you twice have mentioned that they print this out of thin air. So there's nothing but an entry in a ledger that is facilitating this new wealth, if you would, this new money. But not only did they take all of our wealth, but what did they give us in return, and what do we have to pay in interest on this for these people to give us permission to print more of this worthless money?
Well, what they're doing is, what we get out of it is a deflated currency. And what people don't realize is that the more money that the banks are allowed to put out, the less valuable the currency is. And over the decades since the 30s, after we declared bankruptcy in House Joint Resolution 192, 1933, we've been expanding and expanding, and you can see it in our national debt. The national debt is just all the accumulated money that we've been borrowing and all the interest payments accumulated over the years that we haven't been able to pay to. And this system can only go so far until the debt service becomes so great that the amount of money in circulation will be so small that we'll enter into a depression, which is in process right now.
I agree. I agree that we are at that level in time and this whole process that they began in 1913. We have demonstrated on this show what took place with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and this in particularly is what we're speaking of. Bill, if I could, I'd like to read, I call this the Federal Reserve banking system and everything that goes along with it, the international entities and so forth. I call it a cartel. And I'd like to read you the definition of a cartel and get what your impression of this is. A cartel is a group of independent businesses which join together to coordinate the production, pricing, and/or marketing of their members. The purpose of a cartel is to reduce competition and thereby increase profitability. This is accomplished through a shared monopoly over their industry, which forces the public to pay higher prices for their goods or services than would be otherwise required under free enterprise competition. Now, the industry that we're speaking of in this conversation and in this book here is our money system, the banking industry. And I was wondering if you could give us some feedback. Do you agree with this definition of a cartel, and does it apply to the Federal Reserve Bank?
Oh, the cartel is absolutely what it is. It actually violates the Sherman Antitrust and the Clayton Act. It violates the very premise of our society, which is supposed to empower the individual. Mm-hmm. And the individual is now confronted with two political parties that are based on monopoly and are in collusion with the international monopolists running our money system and the subservient industries below it, which are, heavy industries and whatnot.
And would you think this encroachment, if you would, has reached into the government end of our government?
Oh, yeah, from the very onset. Early on, from 1864, when Lincoln signed the National Banking Act, the international banks were definitely had their foot in the door, and this has been going on from the Civil War on. It's not just from the Depression on. In 1868, the fourth section of the 14th Amendment says that we can no longer question the national debt, which seems like an odd assertion inside of an amendment to the Constitution. And if we were still sovereign at that point, how is it we could not question the national debt?
Right.
So.
Right.
Yeah.
It's rather interesting when you look. I mean, Ben Franklin's famous quote about the real reasoning behind the War of Independence was because the king would not allow the colonists to have their interest-free owned money. They wanted to facilitate and use the Bank of England. Of course, there were other things like the Stamp Act, the confiscation of firearms, and so forth. But you're right. This does go back. I've used the example of when's the only time Jesus got mad, and that was when he threw the money changers out of the temple. So this battle has been going on for centuries. It's also on both sides of history. This qualifies itself because when we take out the own writings from, say, the Rothschilds and the Warburgs and others that were behind this and helped facilitate different movements, we see like I said, from both sides that this has been an ongoing battle. But a lot of the American people are, number one, ignorant of their own money system. And they're also ignorant of the basic fact that the Federal Reserve is a private foreign corporation. And how do you think we've gotten to that point, Bill? And do you see us turning it around where more people are becoming educated and/or have at least the interest to ask the questions?
Well, I think the inflationary spiral will drive people to wonder why. I think that last year when we got up over $4 a gallon in gas, that people actually were starting to wonder what the heck is going on here. And now we're back down $2.71, $2.75, and people are starting to question, how did that happen? And some people are actually putting the truth out. The investment bankers, if you give them $1, they can create $30 right now under their own regulations, and in some situations, endless amounts of money. Go in, buy up markets, drive the prices up. Everybody will go in with them once it starts to go up. Drive it up, then pull it out and let it crash and go back and buy it for pennies on the dollar. This is the whiplash way they've been doing it ever since the Rothschilds and Napoleon.
Right.
So,
and what you're speaking of with Napoleon is a very famous event in history at Waterloo, where Rothschild's front people, if you would, got information back to him that the English had won the battle. And Rothschild went into the London securities and started to sell everything. So everybody thought that Rothschild at that point had some inside information, which he did, but he played it the opposite way. Everybody sold out, everything went down, he bought it on pennies on the dollar, or pennies on the pound, if you would. So they do manipulate things, and it's a lot of it's information. And one of the things that you've mentioned is that there are people out there putting out the information. Alternative media is growing in leaps and bounds without any funding and or financing from the mainstream media or the powers to be. Bill, I want to get back a little bit to the Federal Reserve, and I know you're familiar with this. When the Federal Reserve got together at Jekyll Island, there was 5 items that they wanted to make sure that they could facilitate these 5 items inside the Federal Reserve Act, because as we both know, the Federal Reserve Act was written in secrecy by a bunch of international bankers. But one of the things that they wanted to say is how to stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure that control over the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. Obviously, those present would be the people attending the meeting at Jekyll Island. Do you see, has that been accomplished in today's banking system?
well, what's really funny about it all, it was accomplished right from the beginning. There was I brought some paperwork with me. Right from the beginning, in 1912, they had a committee called the Peugeot Committee. And the Peugeot Committee investigation, it was J.P. Morgan, First National Bank, National City Bank, Lee Higginson and Company of Boston and New York, Kidder Peabody, and Kuhn Loeb. They were found to be the centers of concentration. And McFadden in the 30s, the Currency and Finance Committee chairman, he was bringing charges. In Resolution 158 in 1933, May 23rd, 1933, he was bringing charges against him for transferring the metals out of the gold in particular, from the Treasury to so they could go overseas and finance the coming war, which most people had no idea was even about to happen. And this has been going on. Essentially, this problem is basically comes right out of what Jefferson, his famous quote, but hardly anybody knows the famous quote.
Right.
And if the American public ever allow the issue of their currency first by inflation and then deflation, the corporations that grow up around that system will leave the people homeless on the continent their forefathers fought and died for, and are essentially something to that effect. And the inflation and then deflation part is the whole trick. The creation out of currency out of thin air on ledgers by banks, inflating the money supply. And then when he says deflation, he means the repayment and the extinguishing of that same currency while the prices are high. And this system of driving the prices up and then shrinking the money, letting the money supply shrink back, and it shrinks back naturally. They don't even have to do anything, but because we just bring the debts back and they erase the money out of existence. In our present situation, they moved all the good-paying jobs overseas. The kids coming up, the new generations, cannot bring the loans out to match the prior money supply. So we have a shrinking money supply while they drove up the prices, exactly what Jefferson told us would happen.
And we have never heeded his warning.
Exactly.
At least not today, I should say we're not. One of the other things, Bill, this was item number 2 from their own notes, how to make the money supply more elastic in order to reverse the trend of private capital formation and to recapture the industrial loan market. Actually, you just pretty much put that number 1 and number 2 together. You pretty much solidified the whole process and the mechanics as to how that happens and what they do. And then they go on to how to pool the meager reserves of the nation's banks into one large reserve so that all banks will be motivated to follow the same loan-to-deposit ratios. This would protect at least some of them from currency drains and bank runs. Bill, this again goes on to what you were speaking of, and I have my own thoughts on this, but I wonder if you'd like to comment if in fact they have reached that goal.
Well, like I said, they pretty much reached it in 1913 when they put it. They knew they eventually, when the act was passed, Congressman Lindbergh, the famous airman's father, he took to the floor and said, when the president signs this act, the invisible government of the banks will be legalized, proven to exist from the money trust investigation, which was the Peugeot committee hearings. So it was proven that there was an invisible government, and then they went on. And I might add that they used the tactic of playing against it, where they'll buy up newspapers and put out that they're against what really they're for. And in his statement, he talks all about how the industrialists and the bankers and the monopolists are all working together to make it look like the Federal Reserve is part of the government. Mm-hmm. And this is how they've done it all along, is they create the illusion of that they're fighting what they're absolutely for.
Right. We got into a little bit about Paul Warburg. He was really the one who came up with the name Federal Reserve. And the whole thing was based on deception. Number one, he wanted to use the word federal so that people would think it was part of the federal government. But it's no federal, just like Federal Express. As a matter of fact, if you look it up in the phone book, it's not under the government listings. And he wanted to use the word reserves because their ultimate goal was to capture all the intrinsic wealth of the nation. And they wanted to use the word reserve so in the back of people's minds they would think, oh, this is being put away in a reserve for the good of the nation, which we have discovered is not the case at all. And this fourth one, Bill, I found very interesting, especially considering the $23.7 trillion bailout that they just accomplished for themselves. Should this lead eventually to the collapse of the whole banking system, then how to shift the losses from the owners of the banks to the American taxpayer? I'd hate to take the floor from you, but I got to say that $23.7 trillion qualifies as that goal being accomplished. What would you say to that?
Oh, absolutely, and it is bailing out the banks. What they're trying to do right now is keep the balance sheets in the banks on the up and up, so the banks won't go under. But I could have swore that during that bailout, they were talking about helping the mortgage, mm-hmm. the people holding the mortgages. And that's never happened. And all that's happening is exactly what Jefferson said. As they're extinguishing the currency, the president and his crew are bailing out. They're just handing the money banks to keep the balance sheets up. And they will not allow the housing and all the markets to correct to their natural levels. And by doing that, the people that are the older generations of the well-to-do people that are running this situation remain with their wealth. It will not be devalued. I'm sure gradually it will have to come down, but they'll deflate that bubble slowly down to where it is so they don't feel it. And it'll be transferred onto us through, it's highly likely we'll have some form of hyperinflation that will be the tax that will be transferred to us.
Now, there's other taxes. We have this surtax on the war that President Obama is speaking of now. But twice in our conversation so far today, you have mentioned extinguishing the currency. And I wonder if you could give us some thought into exactly what you mean behind them words.
Okay, several years ago, I called the Federal Reserve, and the receptionist told me they weren't part of the government, if that's what my inquiry was. I said I wanted to speak to someone on the board of trustees there, and they said they had an economist. So I got the economist on the phone and I asked her how they made loans, if they actually took money out of my account. And she said, no, they create the loan when they make the loan. They create the money, the currency then, on the spot. And I said, so you mean you print it when you make? She said, no, we don't have to print it. We use a fractional reserve system. All we need is to make ledger entries. So upon that, I asked her, if I give you back the principal of that loan, will that go in the bank's account on the plus side? And she said, no, I will erase that money out of existence. It's called the process of extinguishing funds. So I went on to ask her, if that was the process, how was I supposed to get the money to pay the interest? And she said, oh, that's simple. It had to come out of somebody else's principal, meaning that the whole system was a pyramid scheme. And when I brought that to her attention, she said, okay, yes it is. And if you have a problem with that, call the Attorney General's office. So this is a pretty blatant scheme they're running, and they're not afraid of us knowing.
It sounds like perpetual debt to me.
It is perpetual debt. Yep.
That's really incredible. So what do you see, Bill? I know you've done a lot of studying through different periods of history, not only in the United States, but internationally. What do you, if you had the proverbial crystal ball, not so much with a time perspective, but what do you see happening to the purchasing power of what we call the American dollar?
Well, we're really, if you go by 1933, a dollar is only worth about 3 or 4 cents. I believe we're staring down some form of a devaluation in the next couple of years, the kind that has hit Mexico and a lot of the third world countries.
Argentina.
Right. And it doesn't look good for the American people, and it's because the fact that we let all those factories go overseas, and the only thing that's propped up the dollar is the fact that they use it internationally. So it sort of represents the goods and services of all the other countries too that use it. And by everybody using it, it has kept us afloat. But there are too many countries now, they're talking about disconnecting. And once that disconnect happens, we'll go down, we will actually be left to float down to the natural level that we're at, which will show a lot of the people that are currently out there riding the system that they're going to have to get a job, because it's not going to be able to sustain itself just by inflation anymore.
And doesn't that also make our money system vulnerable to the wishes and demands of the private corporation we know as the Federal Reserve? I mean, they have all the control.
Yeah, they know they have all the control, and you could hear it in the lady's voice when I brought it up. She knew that they were running a pyramid scheme. And I've gone to Bernie Sanders with this information when he was on the currency and on the banking committee. And I can only guess that that's why Bernie is hammering the bankers now, as he knows there are people, constituents that are watching. And the Senate, I don't believe we have much of a chance in, but the House of Representatives, I think there are some people that are responsive to this issue.
I've actually been very impressed with Bernie Sanders, and I'm not so sure I've ever said them words in the past in one sentence, but I have been very, very impressed, and I'm sure the education that you gave Representative Sanders had some weight and bearing on some of the decisions that he's made through the legislature and some of the statements he's made publicly with regards to when Bernanke, he right in his face told Bernie Sanders that he would not tell him, wouldn't give him the institutions and all the corporations where the money went. And Bernie Sanders says, well, I'll be introducing legislation this afternoon to make sure you do. I thought that took a lot of courage on his part because, you know, it's like Ishmael Rothschild said that if you give me control of a nation's currency, I care not who makes its laws, and the reasons being because he's going to have all the control at that point. Do you think Ron Paul's bill to audit the Fed? Do you see that passing, or do you see a watered down version of it? Or
Well, I think it's been completely watered down. But to get back to Bernie's statement, he knows that the Federal Reserve has they can pass all the laws they want. Until they rescind the contract, the laws don't apply. So he knows that that's just posturing. And I don't think that we're going to see a real get down to the nuts and bolts kind of thing yet. But it depends on how fast they can get a police state and a whole lot of propaganda into place before we, doing these kind of programs, wake people up.
no, the police state. I don't know if you had the opportunity to see what that Russian general, through a meeting 2 weeks ago, told Putin that basically the Northern Command, which is domestic operations in the United States, that okay, they have 400,000 soldiers in a deployment mode for domestic operations within the United States. But according to this Russian general now, he has told Putin that Obama is going to push that number to 1 million to be in a ready standby position for domestic operations, and that he wanted that to be accomplished during the time period this winter. Now with what's called the SDR, the special drawing rights, which is another fiat currency that the globalists have come up with through the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund, which to get to the top of the pyramid, the Bank of International Settlements. But now we're at the point where they're going to start using this SDR, as it's known. It's actually in the open commodity market. Do you see this as a mechanism of the beginning of the end of the demise of what we know as the dollar?
Internationally, I think that'll be the coming thing will be something other than a dollar. But I think that they're going to let us die with the dollar here, I think, before they change it. So in the next couple of years here, I'm expecting a serious devaluation, pretty much.
And explain to the people, if you would, what does that mean to their pocketbook, the devaluation of our currency?
Well, they will probably give us a different looking currency, and we will have to trade in. I'll give it go in and hand them $100, and they'll give us $50 or something like that back in the new currency. So they'll bring the value of our currency down in value immediately that way.
So, and that's an immediate effect on the purse strings of the American people.
Right.
You know, a lot of industries through NAFTA and GATT and so forth have gotten tax incentives, as you know, to move our industrial base overseas. And now we have these bailouts with regards to, you know, GM and so forth, you know, government motors as it's going around now. But when you study all what's going on with General Motors, you find out that they've merely are just shutting down North American operations and they're moving operations abroad. Do you see this as a continuing, you know, as was it Ross Perot that said the big sucking sound you're going to hear leaving the nation? Do you see this continuing, or do you think that there's enough industrial base left in this country we can turn it around?
Well, the present policy, it's just like the banks. We bail the banks out and they're continuing the same policies. They're operating in the same way, and everything's sort of still on track. And what people don't realize is, and this is a historical note I think people need to understand. I have at home, and I think you have it also, a video of Smedley Butler, World War I general. And he says, and he's in the theaters, in 1934, it's a newsreel. And he gets on the theater screen and he tells the American public in 1934 that rich industrialists, and he names names, the Reynolds, DuPont, I don't know if it's Ford, but I have an inkling it probably was. Mm-hmm. And they are hiring him to overthrow the government of FDR and install a fascist dictatorship. And this shows you that behind the scenes, the mindset of the international industrialists, the monopolists, is definitely to have a one-world state, just by the mere fact they tried to introduce it in the last depression. And as far as I'm concerned, these depressions are just for social manipulation. That's the whole purpose of the depressions.
And I'll have to go a step further with that, Bill, with regards to war. The audience, the show is familiar with Smedley Butler. We reviewed his book, War is a Racket, and we went over all the profits of the profiteers of war. And I think his words are quite strong, especially for a former Marine who had won 2 Congressional Medal of Honors. That speaks highly for, his noble undertaking in the theater of war. But with that being said, is war not also a tool of the monopolist to facilitate social change?
Yeah, the minutes of the Carnegie Endowment, 1907-1908, they studied how to manipulate societies. They knew the United States, the people of the United States were Christians and wouldn't go for a world government. So they needed to manipulate the values of the Christian population, which all you have to do is look at an old baseball game and you see everybody with shirts and ties and derbies or whatever, and hats and dresses, and they're all dressed up the way people treated each other back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. You can see that they've actually gotten their way with us through wars. Through wars, they can create the strife, and once we're in a highly agitated state and unsure, they can manipulate us easily without, there's hardly any resistance if they frighten us through the implementation of a war.
Well, and I think Henry Kissinger made that famous quote to the fact about using fear. The threat of an outside fear, will manipulate the people to our means. And Bill, doesn't that get us right back to the foundation of the Hegelian dialectic, where they create a crisis to get the desired reaction from the people, and of course they provide the solution, and the solution always strengthens their authority and their purse strings.
Yeah, the Hegelian dialectic is the method they're using. You can see it in the 9/11 event, how they wanted the oil pipeline across Afghanistan. Brzezinski had influence with Bush's advisor, Khalil Azad.
Azad, yeah.
They knew they had to get a foothold in the Middle East because Russia was on its knees. There was too many things up in the air politically, so they create an incident, use the incident, and then go in the Middle East and create permanent bases, jump-off points, so they can manipulate the price of oil to the flow of oil and all the residuals there.
And with regards to the chaos that's taken place in Iraq, I personally believe, especially being that we have the 2 captured English SAS soldiers that were dressed up in Muslim attire and were shooting at a wedding, and they were captured by the I think it was Basra police, and then the English SAS went in and actually broke these guys out of jail. I don't know if you're familiar with that whole incident, but that took place about 3 years ago. But the point to all this is this chaos that is being fomented in Iraq, is this exactly part of the Hegelian dialectic also? Oh,
yeah. A few years back, Harun Rashid Aswat, who was, the British claim was the main guy behind the 7/7 bombings, was trying to build a training base in Oregon in the United States. He was let go. He went to Pakistan. He left Pakistan. He was in England. He was not held there, and he's run around the world, a completely free man. And the British, one arm of the British government looks for him, and the other arm hides him out. And this is the same thing what's going on. The lower level FBI are looking for bin Laden, and the higher ups know either he's dead or where he is.
As I call him Osama Ben Forgotten.
Yeah.
Because, I find it ironic that a fellow who needs dialysis every 9 days could be a stowaway in a cave with no electricity. And I mean, it's just, it's when you really do the research, it's almost comical. It's sad, but it's almost comical because here's this fellow who needs dialysis. By the way, here's a fellow, as you know, that's been employed by the CIA since the late 70s. And it's just amazing to me that the American people, if they did a little bit of their own research besides what the mainstream media provides to them, I think they would see the answers do not add up. Now, with regards to what's going on in Afghanistan, we see all of a sudden now that we're making encroachments through ground troops and through aerial bombing and through missile sites into Pakistan. Do you see now Pakistan with the ISI was very instrumental in the transfer of funds through Muhammad Atta from the CIA? Do you see this as an expansion of the war, or do you think that this is to just bring more turmoil to the region?
Yeah, I think this is an expansion of the war. I'm not sure what. None of it makes sense to me, except for one thing, that this all generates profits and gives them more power. Just like in today's news, there's a bomber that was on a plane. He got through with military-grade explosives. He was on a watch list. His family told the authorities 2 months prior. So it all looks like a staged right at Christmas. So everybody's in a feeling of peace and brotherhood, and boom, they create this one incident. And even if they don't hire the guys or give them the weapons, they shuttle them through and make sure they handle them. They make sure they get them to the right places, make sure all the authorities don't bother them. They literally create the incidences, and all this does is create fear and make us more pliable, more vulnerable to inflation, to their inflationary forces and their war schemes.
And of course, who profits through all this?
Exactly, the same guys.
The old thing, Bill, Key Bono, right?
Yeah.
Who benefits here?
Yeah, the internationalists, the monopolists.
Yep. And explain to the people just how they're benefiting. I mean, obviously their sons and daughters aren't going off to bleed in foreign lands. Right. So how are they profiting, Bill?
Well, there's a video out there, Beyond Treason, by Joyce Riley. It can be gotten on the internet, I believe. And the opening scenes of it, the troops are there with home videos in caches of weaponry that they seized in 1990, 91 in that war there. And what you notice on the boxes of the chemical weapons, which they claim are under Geneva treaties, the first thing you notice is from Oklahoma and Great Britain and France and Switzerland. And you're thinking, how can this possibly be? What they're doing is they arm all the enemies. They armed Hitler. The Bush family was in on that through Brown Brothers Harriman Union Banking. They arm everybody, the Bolsheviks, the Rockefellers, the Standard Oil, Chase Manhattan were there. The Tsar had his money in the Chase Manhattan banks and the banks in Chicago the day they overthrew him. They had all the motive to make sure they created a peasant state because they had no desire to return that gold back to the Russian people.
Right, and the Russian people hence have been living in a pauper state ever since.
Right.
It's amazing. We use the example at one point on the show. We showed the demonstrations by so-called illegal immigrants. There was like 800,000 of these people in Washington, D.C. And I had, you have to ask the question, okay, wait a minute, how they organize? I mean, that takes a lot of logistical effort to coordinate that kind of people, that sheer number of people. And of course, when you look at the signs, they're all perfect signs, professionally made. Or, there's rental toiletries, there's food allotments, there's everything else. So how is it that these 800,000 illegal immigrants that supposedly don't have a shirt on their back were able to organize, finance, and logistically put together and transport all these people to Washington, D.C. And what we get into is we find out the different foundations that are behind a lot of these movements. And you know, I don't know if you ever read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, a local New Hampshire fella. And he was one of the money people for the IMF. He would go in and make all these different arrangements through the different countries, and of course it was always control of resources. It was always control of their money system. Do you see that still in effect today? The Rockefeller foundations and all these foundations and so forth. Number one, Bill, how is it that they get this privilege with these tax separations? They don't have to pay taxes on all these different things. And number two, who are behind these foundations?
Well, the major international industrialists, the monopolists, are definitely, they own the foundations. And they get away with this because they pretty much own our Congress. I mean, our president right now, although everybody thought they were getting a man of the people, which they keep doing this to us. You know, Bush is drinking beer in a bar right before he got elected with the average person. These people are nothing but the international family's puppets. Barack Obama, I knew sooner or later they would find a black man that fit right into their mold. There are plenty of black candidates out there, absolutely good, honest, patriotic gentlemen that could run this country very well. Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams. But what they chose was a man who was a puppet of the banks that would promote bailing them out and continue promoting the wars and the disintegration of our own economic future.
And look at to President Obama, if you look at the campaign promises as compared to the reality of what's taken place now that we've had this window of time to actually see, what he was going to do. I mean, he was going to get the troops out of the United States. I mean, excuse me, out of the wars. He'd bring them back to the United States. He was going to put up on the internet for 10 days any legislation that came to his desk so the American people would have the opportunity to read it and see what's in the legislation. Has any of that taken place? And what has happened with the position of the bankers ever since President Obama has been in office?
Well, he's done nothing but help them, and he's proposing even newer, stronger powers for the Federal Reserve. I just don't see any way around this unless we get some real populists in power on both sides of the aisle or a third party. The list is not long because there are so few people in positions of power that'll actually admit that this is going on, because it's almost an instant suicide in the establishment right now.
And I find it interesting if you wish to get on to maybe some of the solutions. I think everybody is aware that we do have a problem. The base of it, I know, is coming from who's controlling our money system. Because if you control the money system, everything else falls in place, whoever controls the money system. I personally, Bill, think that this effort has to be made at a grassroots and or local arena. I think the federal government, if you're up into the upper echelon of the federal government, you're there by placement. You're not there by election. You're there by the people who really control everything. And so I feel that if we're going to turn this around, we've got to do it at the local arena, say with the states. I'm a firm believer that the states have to take back their just powers by the Constitution of the United States. That's a whole other discussion. Is the Constitution of the United States still an effective document, or has that been usurped?
Well, this comes down to what we use for money. And this is where people when people say, well, it doesn't matter, I can still buy it with this or piece of paper or whatever, seashells. But everybody desires gold and silver. All the well-to-do, all the connected, there are industrial purposes for both of those metals. They are intrinsically valuable. Now, when we went off of a barter system, what people don't realize is there are only two economic systems. That stuff they taught you in schools where it's communism, capitalism, socialism, those are political systems. The two economic systems are barter and credit. And if you go onto a credit system, the people that own that system, just like in the hills of West Virginia, they own the store, they own the housing, they own your job, they own the scrip. And if you can just look at that system in those coal mines of West Virginia, that's a microcosm of what they're trying to do on the macro level.
Hence that old song, who was it, Tennessee?
Ernie Ford.
Ernie Ford. I owe my soul to the company store.
And that's what we do.
Agreed. As a matter of fact, when you get into a document called the birth certificate, you will see that we literally do. It's amazing when you research the history behind that. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, we don't have a lot of time to go down that road.
Well, I do have a copy of a birth certificate.
Well, you go ahead then.
And if you can see this at all, right here, down in this corner, next to this seal, right in that scrolling, right in where you normally wouldn't see it, it says American Banknote Company. The American Banknote Company is an arm of the Commerce Department, Budget and Management, Office of Budget and Management, and they print only collateralized, securitized documents. And the security or collateral for this document, your birth certificate, is you and your future earnings and property.
And Bill, I know we have some short time. Well, let's dig right into that, seeing you brought that up. I have a copy of mine also, and I'm the Midwest Bank Note Company, and from the different research we find, them are the two companies that do this. But the key word you used there was collateralized. Why don't you get into that a little bit?
Well, you know, we had the slaves back in the old days. They were called indentured servants. And essentially, there isn't much difference to what is going on right now. We are definitely indentured servants, and the birth certificate is written evidence of this situation we're in, and it's because we do not use barter. We do not use things that we own as money anymore. And by the use of privately owned money, everything that we buy and sell is under what is known as clouded title. And this is why people go in the courts all the time trying to fight the banks and the government and lose, because we have no standing, because we do not use our own property to buy and sell with.
In the old days, Bill, we had a document was called a allodial title. Allodial meaning Latin for absolute. You owned it. As you say, it was yours. It was your possession. And now we have a certificate of title. And the certificate is literally bearer use. So someone's allowing you to use this, okay? And it's collateralized. When we talk about getting into the money system and how all this debt is perpetual debt, this is our labors for the rest of our lives and our children's lives that are facilitating or collateralizing this debt. Do you think if every mother in this country understood, number one, this is a firm belief of mine, if every mother in this country understood what the birth certificate was, and if every American understood what our money system was, and I will use a quote from Henry Ford, be it well that the American people do not understand their money system, for I fear there would be revolution by morning. Would you agree with that statement, if the American people ever got educated on it, just them two entities themselves?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And there's really simple solutions that wouldn't even require a shot being fired. If we were to stop the banks from extinguishing the currency was created against the wealth, a house, a car, a farm. If we required the banks to transfer that currency, that credit, to the Treasury, and it became the property of the people of the United States, the way it's supposed to be, and not to be erased out of existence from that point on, we could eliminate this entire system overnight. It would just be a matter of those credits being transferred to the Treasury and then being put out by the Treasury Department. So
are you sort of, I'm trying to put this together, Bill, going along with the idea of federalizing the Fed?
Well, I think that we need a Treasury-based money system. And if that we could absorb the Federal Reserve, put the owners out to pasture, and carry it on and let mathematicians decide how this is going to work, and to make it a stronger system, base it on gold and silver, the way that we have for 6,000 years.
And that's why with the Founding Fathers it was so important to them, Article 1, Section 8, to make sure that the Congress could regulate the value thereof, and our money system must have intrinsic value on species of gold and silver. And because what that does is that takes the mathematicians, the controllers of that system, it takes that instrument away from them, because there is a foundation, there is a base, and you can't create these fluctuations. With regards, Bill, to what we see going on today, we no longer are an industrialized nation. Even our service sector of the economy is going to, India and different parts of the country. We're not producing anything. As a matter of fact, I was shocked to read that even the radar system for one of our top the F-35, our new V-STOL aircraft, the radar system is actually, what used to be built in Indiana is now built in China. And when I go on and go on and go on, we don't even make TVs or televisions anymore. There's nothing that we produce. Our money system is fiat. Our banking system is purely a fractional banking system holding no intrinsic value. I can't help but think of Germany during when the Weimar Republic fell and the money system fell. Do you see any comparisons of that today from the American people to the German people?
Oh, strong comparisons. And there seems to be a willingness, just like in Germany, to put their head in the sand. Real similar.
Do you think the American people, through education and just not cooperating with these bankers anymore, can turn this around? Do you think we can do this?
I think it's up to each. The Constitution is based on the 9th and 10th Amendment, basically. We have all the rights we need. The 9th Amendment says they have to prove that we don't have the rights. Mm-hmm. And the 10th Amendment grants each individual the right as the power base for the county, the state, and the federal government. If we were to take and ask our state governments to take up collections of silver and put out state notes, the United States would rise overnight.
Something along the means of what John Kennedy did with silver certificates.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what took place there was a travesty, and the idea, number one, that John Kennedy was actually trying to, number one, he had the understanding of who was controlling the country, and also what avenue they were taking us down, and number two, he had the courage and the honorability to actually go forward and create silver certificates. And what I remember that as a child, and what I remember is everybody wanted it because they knew there was some intrinsic value, the value of silver behind that certificate. Do you think with what's going on internationally with these wars with regards to the fact that some of these countries wanted to create a currency based out of the value of a barrel of oil, putting intrinsic value on it? I think it all comes down to the point of having intrinsic value. And again, we could do this at a local basis. I'm in the middle of a study on the American Great Depression. An interesting quote in the beginning of the book is that there was 3,200 local currencies throughout the country that people recognized and used on a local basis with regards to barter and having a mechanism of trade. Do you think with your idea of being local and doing the silver again, the people would, number one, not only get a tremendous education on the money system, but number two, maybe we could get the grasp of the international bankers off of us?
Yeah, it would bring back a value that they couldn't manipulate necessarily. I think some of these local currencies are a good idea. I know in Utica, I've talked to the guy over there, they use anything of wealth. They have use a warehouse. You bring down a chair, they value it into the currency that we use. Of course, there's the catch. Mm-hmm. But then they'll issue a certificate based on that value. And then the warehouse is essentially a store where people come and can buy the items.
Bill, we have a short time here, but I wonder if you would touch on the Liberty Dollar. Most Americans are not aware of what the Liberty Dollar was and what they were trying to do. Would you touch on that real briefly?
Yeah, you're talking about the Norfed.
Correct.
Yeah. I have one of those at home. I hope the BATF won't show up and get it.
Yeah.
But private individuals issued this. It was a private company. And they tried to bring us back to silver-based certificates. And eventually the government closed them down and seized it.
And why do you think the government would not, a constitution says we're going to have silver as a base of currency. Who was the government actually acting for by shutting that down?
Well, the government operates under the Uniform Commercial Code, so they're operating for the International Monetary Fund.
Exactly. And Bill, with that, I have to say thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful to have you on. You're a wealth of information. We'll have to have you on again at some point.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Folks, as always, we thank you very much for watching our program. We hope you enjoyed our program today and gained some good information from it. As always, we remind you that your government is your responsibility. Again, we thank you for watching.